Hey guys, tonight we're starting with one of history's most infamous episodes, not just because of its devastation, but because of how profoundly it reshaped the world. The Black Death. A 14th century calamity that combined confusion, fear, superstition, and a lethal microbe no one could see, carried by fleas with an uncanny talent for infiltration. But this isn't just about death statistics or timelines. It's about the choices, desperate, absurd, or ingenious, that might have kept you alive if you had been unlucky enough to be born in the wrong city at the wrong time. So before you get too cozy, take a second to show some love with a like or subscribe. Only if this kind of journey through time is your thing. Drop a comment too. Where are you watching from? What time is it for you right now? I always love seeing the names and places that gather here to time travel with me. All right, lower the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that medieval ambience of wind and distant doom. Because our journey begins now, with your first decision, one that might determine everything else, where you choose to live. If you imagined yourself thriving in a bustling medieval metropolis, congratulations, you're already in grave danger. 14th century cities weren't charming dioramas of medieval romance. They were dense clusters of humanity crammed into timber houses, leaning at impossible angles, stitched together with the hopes of surviving winter, fire, or invasion. Plumbing didn't exist, streets doubled as open sewers, and sanitation was something the pigs were expected to handle badly. And rats. Rats weren't just residents. They were co-owners of the property. Major cities like Florence, London, or Paris were more than cultural hubs. They were death traps in disguise. Imagine tightly packed homes with livestock inside, no proper ventilation, and open market stalls overflowing with unwashed hands and bad decisions. If you were trying to buy a cabbage, you'd be bumping shoulders with 20 people, and one of them was probably days away from becoming a cautionary tale. You didn't even need to be sick yourself. Being within shouting distance of someone sniffling could mark the start of your countdown. But escape wasn't impossible. If you had the means, or just the foresight, to relocate to the countryside, you dramatically increased your odds of not dying a horrible, feverish death. In remote villages, far from the chaos of trade routes and public gatherings, you had a fighting chance. There were fewer people to breathe on you, fewer gatherings to be cursed by, and far fewer opportunities for infected fleas to hitch a ride into your home on a rat. If you were especially lucky, you might have found shelter in an isolated monastery, a place where solitude was a virtue and silence a rule. Some of these places, particularly among certain religious orders, functioned almost like accidental quarantine facilities, well before anyone understood what quarantine meant. In truth, the best survival strategy in 1348 might not have been about medicine at all. It was about distance. Distance from the markets, from the town centers, from the temptation to linger and chat with neighbors. When someone coughed near you, whether politely into a sleeve or violently toward the heavens, the correct response wasn't concern or compassion. It was immediate and unapologetic withdrawal. Run, disappear. The less contact, the better. And while we didn't yet have the language of social distancing, we had the instincts. Humans, after all, are not entirely foolish. Some learned early, by watching friends collapse in public squares or family members fade within days, that separation wasn't cowardice, it was prudence. Those who packed up and left at the first whisper of illness often found themselves ridiculed by those who stayed behind, until those same mockers stopped answering their doors. And for the wealthy, retreat wasn't just strategy, it was a luxury. Some noble families fled to private estates, isolated retreats where their social calendars were replaced with quiet gardens and well-stocked wine cellars. They wrote poetry, they stayed away, and they survived. Meanwhile, ordinary townsfolk learned these same lessons, but at a steeper cost. The hard way, Markets became roulette wheels, weddings became potential Last Suppers, and festivals, well, let's just say they were attended mostly by the statistically reckless. Avoiding them wasn't just antisocial. It was genius. If you chose to speak only to your dog, or spent your evenings muttering to the family cat while sharpening sticks, you were doing something right. This wasn't paranoia. It was math. Every interaction, every errand, every shared loaf of bread was a potential death sentence. In a time before viruses had names or vaccines had vials, the only defense you had was your behavior. So yes, being boring, hiding in the woods, canceling your cousin's wedding visit, pretending not to hear knocks at the door, wasn't just prudent, it was survival. But even the cautious had to navigate another battlefield. Fashion. In the next part, we'll talk about how your wardrobe could literally kill you, and why those flowing robes of status might have been death sentences disguised as elegance. If you manage to escape the crowds and retreat to a safer patch of land, don't get too comfortable. Because even alone in a quiet village or hilltop farm, danger had a way of slipping through your defenses. And one of the most unexpected culprits? Your clothes. Medieval fashion was no casual affair. For the wealthy, it was armor made of silk and velvet, trimmed in fur and layered for days. Long sleeves dragged through the dust, cloaks swirled like banners, each piece whispered status. Unfortunately, it also shouted welcome to parasites. The more fabric you wore, the more territory you offered to the real invaders. Fleas. In a world where bathing was rare and wardrobes consisted of a few prized outfits per person, your clothing became not just a fashion statement, but a mobile ecosystem, one that fleas adored. Thick fabric and fur lining created cozy corridors for infestation. And once fleas hitched a ride on your robe, they didn't need a second invitation to introduce you to a particularly unfriendly bacterium. Rich or poor, everyone was fair game. But the poor, with simpler clothes and fewer layers, ironically offered fewer hiding spots for vermin. Survival sometimes came not from gold or land, but from having a tunic so short and sleeves so tight that fleas couldn't get comfortable. Linen, the humble workman's fabric, turned out to be one of the quiet heroes of the era. Fleas didn't seem to care for it, and those who washed their clothes more than once per moon cycle, rare but not unheard of, were even better off. In some villages, fear took hold of the wardrobe entirely. People burned clothes, they burned blankets, not because they understood bacteria, but because they knew something wasn't right. The garments of the dead were seen as dangerous, cursed with invisible poison. And in some morbid way, they were right. Fleas could live for days without a host, tucked into seams, waiting for the next victim to button them up. And yet, people still adorned themselves with garlic necklaces, sprigs of rosemary, or perfumed pouches. These were meant to purify the air, to defend against the so-called bad humors. In practice, they did nothing, except perhaps make your neighbors keep their distance. And in those days, that was a win. The goal wasn't to smell good. It was to smell so aggressively herbal that people avoided standing too close. That, in itself, might have saved lives. But if you thought dressing like a knight could help, think again. Armor wasn't a shield against disease. You couldn't intimidate the plague with a breastplate or outduel it with a longsword. And for those proud warriors who refused to remove their gauntlets, who stood tall while others fled, many learned too late that courage does not impress a microscopic killer. Location could give you an edge, though. Geography wasn't just about scenery. It could mean the difference between being spared or consumed. If you lived near lowlands, marshes, or city centers, you were in trouble. If your home sat high on a hill, kissed by wind and removed from the stink of humanity, your chances soared. Hills didn't just offer beauty, they offered fewer rats, colder air, and better ventilation. Disease liked stagnant places, crowded rooms, and unmoving air, but breezes whispered hope. Rats weren't climbers by nature. Fleas hated the cold. Combine those facts, and you had a decent argument for why mountaintop monasteries fared better than city squares. People noticed. They may not have written scientific journals, but they saw who lived and who didn't. They saw that life clung longer to those who stayed far from the riverside ghettos, the swamp-ringed farms, and the low-lying manors heavy with moisture and mystery. And then, of course, came the bath, or lack thereof. By the 14th century, personal hygiene was in decline. Earlier centuries had embraced bathhouses, even communal ones, places of heat, cleansing, and gossip. But when the Black Death swept through, many people believed water itself was the enemy. The prevailing wisdom claimed that bathing opened the pores and made the body vulnerable. In other words, washing was dangerous, so dirt accumulated, oil clung, clothes crusted, skin cracked, and into this feast came the fleas, undisturbed by soap and emboldened by filth. Those who washed, rare though they were, didn't do it out of scientific knowledge. They did it out of superstition or ritual or simple stubbornness. Some bathed in vinegar or wine. Some threw herbs into the water. It wasn't effective, but it was something. And sometimes that something meant just enough to tip the scales. Laundry was its own battlefield. Boiling garments took time and effort. Many did it only when lice became unbearable or public shame too great. But those who managed to wash their linen weekly, or who dared to rotate their outfits regularly, earned a level of cleanliness that, by the standards of the age, bordered on miraculous. Tooth care, if you can call it that, consisted of salt, ash, or chewed herbs. Did it help with the plague? Not at all. But if you had to plead for help on your deathbed, at least you wouldn't knock your caretaker unconscious with your breath. Even so, many still trusted the wrong people, the doctors. Next, we'll enter the world of medicine, a place where bleeding was therapy, birds wore masks, and garlic was prescribed more liberally than common sense. Imagine you're feeling unwell in 1349. Your head aches, your skin burns, and somewhere deep inside, something feels terribly wrong. Naturally, you call for help. But calling a doctor in plague-ridden Europe wasn't a promise of healing. It was more like placing a bet you were unlikely to win. To be fair, they meant well. Most of them. But their understanding of disease was shaped less by observation and more by ancient texts, bad guesses, and theories held together with faith and fear. The dominant medical philosophy at the time was rooted in the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, it meant something inside you was out of balance. The fix? Drain something, preferably blood, sometimes sweat, occasionally hope. You might arrive at a physician's door coughing and bleeding, and their response would be to cut you open with precision, or leeches. Leeching was the medieval equivalent of hitting reboot on the human body. And if leeches weren't handy, a blade would do. The idea was to let the bad out. But often, all that left was life itself. And then there were the infamous plague doctors. Men dressed like walking nightmares, clad in long dark robes and those grotesque bird-like masks. The beak wasn't for show. It was filled with aromatic herbs, flowers, and spices. The logic was simple. Bad air caused the plague, so breathing through a portable bouquet might filter the poison. It didn't, but at the very least, it made the doctor slightly less nauseated while standing knee-deep in despair. Their tools were equally dramatic. Wooden canes allowed them to poke and prod patients from a safe distance. If things went badly, and they usually did, that same stick could nudge a body toward a waiting cot or grave. Sage was burned. Rooms were smoked. Doors were nailed shut. Garlic was eaten by the handful, rubbed on wounds or carried in sacks. It was part prayer, part panic, and wholly ineffective. The list of medieval cures reads like a manual for self-destruction, onion poultices applied to armpits, crushed gemstones swallowed with wine, dead animals tied around the neck, sitting in smoke-filled chambers until you passed out. Some methods were so bizarre they bordered on performance art. Others were just dangerous, and yet, in all this chaos, there were quiet successes. People who skipped the show and stuck to the basics. Nuns who kept wounds clean. Herbalists who focused on rest, broth, and fresh air. Women, midwives, caretakers, healers, who had no degrees or titles, but who washed their hands, tended gently to the sick, and outlived many of the men in masks. There were also the monks, particularly the silent, stay-at-home kind. Orders like the Carthusians, who already lived in self-imposed seclusion, found themselves almost accidentally immune to the worst of the outbreak. Their lives, structured around solitude, routine, and prayer, became templates for unintentional quarantine. They weren't trying to avoid infection, they were just avoiding everyone. And in 1349 that was revolutionary. Their monasteries, perched on hills or tucked into forgotten valleys, became sanctuaries, places with clean water, stored food, and a complete lack of communal festivals. They didn't share spoons. They didn't hug. They didn't sing in crowded taverns, and crucially, they didn't rely on trade routes to survive. But not all monks remained in the safety of their cloisters. Some chose to leave their walls and serve, walking straight into the dying cities to comfort the afflicted. Their bravery was real, and so were the consequences. Many died quickly. The ones who stayed behind, the reclusive, unassuming, almost invisible ones, survived. Not because they were cowards, because they followed routines that, by sheer accident, aligned with the best practices of a world that hadn't yet invented germ theory. And you didn't need to shave your head or chant in Latin to benefit from their wisdom. You just had to emulate their lifestyle. Live far away, eat simply, speak little, and keep your door shut. Still, not everyone had the luxury of retreat. Some people had to work. They were the messengers, the traders, the carriers of news and goods. They moved between villages, through towns and ports, shaking hands and exchanging letters, unaware that every scroll they delivered might also carry death. Coming up next, we'll follow them, the jobs that helped the world keep turning, and how they exposed their bearers to everything the plague had to offer. To survive the plague, sometimes it wasn't about how you lived. It was about what you did. Your job could be the difference between a quiet, healthy existence and a front-row seat to the apocalypse. And in 1349, some professions came with perks no one wanted. Constant exposure to strangers, travel through infected regions, and the chance to carry death in a satchel. Take the messenger. Their task seemed noble enough. Delivering letters, royal decrees or news of faraway events, but in an age where even a shared scroll might bear invisible killers, their work was like dancing blindfolded through a minefield. Each town they entered was a mystery. Had the plague struck yet? Were the locals suspicious? Sick? Dead? No matter. The job had to be done, the letters exchanged, and with every scroll passed from hand to hand. So too passed breath, sweat, and risk. Then there were the merchants, the lifeblood of medieval commerce, moving goods between cities and nations, keeping markets full and wardrobes fresh. But when the plague arrived, they became vectors. They traveled roads haunted by whispers and suspicion, crossed borders that no longer welcomed them, and brought with them not just silks and spices, but fleas. Their wagons and wares, their boots and bags. All potential carriers of infection. These weren't evil men, they were necessary. Without them, cities starved. But necessity didn't grant immunity. They fell sick as often as their customers, and in many cases, sooner. Contrast that with the quiet worker, the blacksmith toiling in his forge, the baker with flour on his hands and soot on his face, the shepherd who spent more time among sheep than people. These men didn't travel, they didn't mingle, They stayed where they were, their routines unbroken by festivals or fairs. They didn't just bake bread or fix shoes. They cultivated isolation. Even more ironically, one of the most morbid jobs, gravedigger, offered surprising protection. These were men already surrounded by the dead, armed with shovels and gloves, sometimes even rags soaked in vinegar wrapped around their faces. They understood risk intimately, and because of that, they developed habits. Avoid touching the face, dig quickly, burn what could be burned. That gave them an edge, however slim. Solitary professions blossomed. The recluse, the artisan, the goat herder who rarely came to town and preferred the company of animals to people. Suddenly, the odd ones, the quiet ones, were thriving. The weaver who turned away sick clients, the cobbler who claimed to be booked for months, the midwife who insisted on leaving remedies at the door instead of entering homes. Their hesitation, once seen as rudeness, became wisdom. The fewer errands you ran, the fewer chances the plague had to follow you home. And then there were the real villains, not people, but creatures. Rats, the ever-present backdrop of medieval life. They didn't just scurry in the shadows. They climbed walls, shared your food, raised families beneath your bed. And most importantly, they carried passengers, tiny, lethal fleas that didn't care about borders, class, or creed. Your greatest act of survival might have been as simple as protecting your food. Grain stored on the ground, invitation, bread left exposed, buffet. The smarter households elevated their supplies, sealed them in ceramic jars, or even suspended storage boxes from rafters like medieval chandeliers. It wasn't style, it was survival strategy. Cats helped when they were allowed to live. But superstition often got in the way. In some towns, cats were seen as bad omens, witches' familiars. They were hunted, killed, driven off. The result? Rat populations soared. The line of defense was gone, and with it, any hope of holding back the wave. Garbage, too, was a battlefield. Tossing scraps out the window was easy. It was also a gift to rodents. Smart survivors learned to move waste far from their homes, even if it meant angering a neighbor. Better an insulted friend than an infected family. But if you think the worst threat was physical, think again. Sometimes, the deadliest danger was panic. When people are terrified and confused, they look for answers. And if no answers come, they invent enemies. The Black Death didn't just devastate bodies, it twisted minds. Mobs formed, rumors exploded. Fear made neighbors turn on each other. Next, we'll walk into the hysteria, the chaos of blame, the violence of suspicion, and the frightening truth about how fear can be just as contagious as any disease. Fear does strange things to people. In times of crisis, it doesn't just twist the facts. It warps the very fabric of community. During the Black Death, fear wasn't just a companion, it became a weapon. And the terrifying truth was this. Once the plague took root, it didn't need to kill everyone. People were more than willing to do the job themselves. With no clear explanation for what was happening, no microscope, no understanding of bacteria, no coherent medical advice, the human mind filled in the blanks, and it filled them badly. Some blamed outsiders, others blamed sinners. Many turned to the easiest scapegoats. Anyone who looked different, acted strange, or simply arrived in town a few days too early. Entire communities, once peaceful, erupted into suspicion. Whispers became accusations. Accusations became violence. Wells were said to be poisoned. Foreigners were chased out. Minority groups, especially Jews, were brutally targeted across Europe, blamed for everything from disease to drought. It didn't matter that the accusations were baseless. What mattered was that people were scared, and when logic fails, torches rise. Even those with no malice in their hearts were caught in the undertow. A widow who lived alone with too many herbs in her kitchen. Witch, a healer whose remedies failed to cure the dying, fraud, an astrologer who read the stars too confidently, sorcerer. People clung to any explanation, no matter how wild, because the alternative, that the plague was unstoppable, was unbearable. Ironically, the mob often caused more harm than the very disease it feared. Groups formed under the pretense of protection, but their methods, burning homes, driving out strangers, gathering in tight crowds to shout and punish, only ensured fast transmission. Violence didn't purify towns. It invited the plague in with open arms. The people who survived, more often than not, they were the quiet ones. The ones who didn't join mobs or shout in the square. They stayed inside, locked the door, didn't go out to punish or purge or accuse. They boiled water. They minded their animals. They said nothing and waited. Because panic spreads faster than any illness. It jumps from mind to mind, turning reason into rubble. And when enough people give in to that panic, a town doesn't just lose its sick, it loses its soul. So some chose a different path. Not violent, not loud, just oddly pungent. Enter garlic. A pungent bulb, a kitchen staple, and, during the plague, an all-purpose talisman of survival. People ate it raw, hung it over doorways, wore it like jewelry. It became a badge of hope, a barrier of smell, a desperate prayer disguised as lunch. Why garlic? Not because anyone had hard evidence, but because it smelled strong. In a world where disease was thought to travel through bad air, masking that air with something stronger seemed like a solid plan. If you reeked of garlic, maybe the plague would think twice. And strange as it sounds, they might have stumbled into a small truth. Garlic does have mild antibacterial properties. Modern science tells us that it repels insects and microbes. So while people in the 14th century didn't know what they were doing, their overwhelming scent may have actually reduced their appeal to fleas. But let's not romanticize it. Garlic wasn't magic. You could still get sick. You could still die. All the cloves in the world wouldn't help if you wandered into the market, kissed a cousin, and shared a communal mug with a dying man. Garlic was a ritual, a hope. At best, it bought you time. At worst, it kept your neighbors socially distant, which wasn't the worst outcome. Other scents joined the war. People clutched herbs and flowers, bundled posies, or carried perfumed pouches. They weren't chasing beauty. They were trying to survive. Inhaling mint, sage, or lavender wasn't a luxury. It was a way to tell yourself, I'm still alive. And the truth is, those who practiced these rituals often lived differently. They kept to themselves. They avoided cesspits. They changed their clothes, washed on occasion, and stayed far from street feasts and festivals. The flowers weren't the cure. The habits were. But the biggest survival trait wasn't in your pocket. It was in your personality, because when the world is dying loudly, the quiet ones endure. Next, we'll meet those people, the introverts, the hermits, the perpetual no-shows, and discover how simply being unsociable became a superpower. Survival in plague-era Europe didn't always come down to wealth or wisdom. Sometimes it came down to something much simpler: disinterest in people. The less you craved company, the less you craved danger. The introverts, the hermits, the socially reluctant, they didn't just avoid awkward conversations. They avoided funerals. If you were the kind of person who skipped every gathering, dodged every dinner, and politely declined every invitation with a vague excuse about chores, congratulations. You were built for this moment. In an era when togetherness could kill, solitude became strategy. That neighbor who always said, I'll stop by later, and never did. Alive. The grumpy couple who never attended the harvest festival, never brought gifts to weddings, and never joined in prayer circles. Still breathing. And while some of their neighbors fell into illness trying to be kind, offering bread to the sick, checking in on elderly aunts, These introverts quietly thrived. Not because they were cruel, but because they understood, perhaps intuitively, that distance wasn't heartless. It was necessary. In many homes, even families practiced their own brand of quarantine, eating apart, sleeping apart, watching each other with a mix of love and caution. If someone sneezed, it didn't just earn a concerned glance. It earned exile to the barn, not out of spite, but survival. Medieval compassion had limits. Even monasteries, for all their community spirit, adopted variations of this. If a monk grew pale or coughed too much, he was moved to another cell, another wing, or simply outside. The rules were firm. Stay healthy or stay gone. And still, for all your good habits, all your careful choices, there was one element you couldn't predict: luck. Dumb, blind, baffling luck. You could do everything right, avoid people, boil your linens, eat garlic like a zealot, and still get bitten by one persistent flea on one unfortunate day. But luck favored the boring, the uneventful, the cautious. It did not favor the adventurous. People who popped into town for fun, who traveled just to see friends, who insisted that one market trip couldn't hurt. They didn't make it. They were the ones who turned up at funerals only to become guests of honor by week's end. Routine became a shield, a life so monotonous that it offered no opportunities for exposure. No visits, no surprises, no changes. Just the same meals, the same quiet path to the well, the same animals, the same muttered prayers. It wasn't exciting, but it worked. And then there were the truly lucky ones, those blessed not by behavior, but by biology. Today, we know that some people carried genetic mutations that made them more resistant to the plague's effects. At the time, no one understood why one sibling died and another didn't. Why one entire family vanished while the goat herder up the hill, who talked to himself, survived untouched. They just knew some people never got sick, and those people often seemed unremarkable. They lived alone. They loved cats. They didn't like guests. They boiled everything and went nowhere. They weren't the center of town gossip. They weren't present at community dances. They were just there. Quiet. Watchful. Forgotten until one day they were the only ones left. But survival didn't end with breath. It required proof. A story. A record. To survive the Black Death wasn't just to live. It was to ensure someone remembered that you had. And that's where we go next. To the scribes, the monks, the survivors with ink-stained hands who turned plague into legacy. You've survived, somehow. You've weathered the coughing, the silence, the burning fever, the empty streets. You've outlasted neighbors and friends, evaded the bite of unseen enemies, and learned how to make garlic stew 7 different ways. The worst has passed, or so you think. Now comes the final, most human instinct, to make sure someone knows you are here. Because what is survival if it leaves no echo? In the years following the Black Death, those who lived faced a new kind of burden. Not just rebuilding homes and burying the dead, but deciding how to tell the story, and who got to tell it. Some survivors turned to ink. Monks, mostly, scratching quiet notes into margins of prayer books. A great pestilence came, and many died. A sentence that seemed small until you realized the hand that wrote it trembled. The eyes behind it had seen too much, and the room around it was emptier than ever before. Others were more ambitious. Giovanni Boccaccio, for instance, fled Florence with a group of friends and wrote The Decameron, a collection of tales told by plague survivors hiding in the countryside. It wasn't just literature. It was a memorial, a way to turn horror into narrative, loss into legacy. But most survivors weren't poets or scribes. They were farmers, widows, midwives. Their memories didn't make it into books. They lived on in stories whispered by grandchildren, in letters tucked into chests, in property records that suddenly skipped a generation. Even those who didn't write found ways to leave a mark. Symbols carved into doors, names etched into church pews. Strange charms buried under floorboards, not because they were beautiful, but because they meant something. I was here. I survived. Writing wasn't just for vanity. It was an act of defiance. In a time when so many vanished without record, putting pen to parchment was a way to say, I mattered. I saw this. I endured. But the danger wasn't over. Some survivors, desperate for connection after so much isolation, rushed back to town. They opened their doors, hugged too soon, believed the worst was past, and many of them didn't live to regret it. The plague came in waves. Celebration often became a funeral rehearsal. The true survivors were those who stayed cautious, who didn't let down their guard, who waited, and then waited longer. They picked up a quill only when the fever had truly gone. They returned to the field slowly, rebuilt homes carefully, and spoke of the dead in soft, uncertain tones. And maybe their diary was never read. Maybe their note in the margin was forgotten. But somewhere, centuries later, a historian would brush the dust from a page and find their voice again. Because to survive a catastrophe is one thing. To survive it and leave behind proof, something the future can hold, that is immortality in disguise. But the Black Death wasn't the only time terror swept the world. Long before microscopes or medicine, long before modern names for disorders or diseases, there was another shadow that followed humanity, the torment of the mind. And next, we step further back, into ancient lands where madness wasn't an illness. It was a message from gods or demons. Long before the Black Death, before quarantines or leeches or masks stuffed with herbs, there was another kind of suffering that terrified ancient civilizations. A different kind of illness, one without boils or fevers, but just as feared. Madness. Not the kind whispered about in fairy tales, but the real, visible breakdown of the mind. And in those distant centuries, people didn't see it as medical. They saw it as something far stranger, divine, cursed, or both. In ancient Mesopotamia, if someone wept for no reason, heard voices no one else could hear, or screamed in terror at invisible shapes, they weren't labeled as mentally ill. They were seen as possessed, not metaphorically, literally. The Sumerians believed that evil spirits could enter a body and seize control. A twitch, a howl, a hallucination. These weren't symptoms. They were proof that a demon had moved in, and so healing didn't involve herbs or care. It involved ritual, chants, prayers, and spells recited by trained exorcists. Clay tablets from Assyria describe incantations designed to drive out the spirit, not comfort the soul. These were not fringe beliefs. This was the system. The priest wasn't just a spiritual guide. He was a frontline medic, waging war against invisible invaders of the psyche. Across the Nile, the ancient Egyptians offered a different view, but not necessarily a gentler one. Their medical texts, like the Ebers Papyrus, hinted at both body and spirit. If you forgot your name or lost your appetite for living, it might be because your heart, not your brain, mind you, but your heart had been disturbed, or your womb had wandered, or a god had turned his gaze against you. Treatment, purification rituals, sacred aromas, appeals to divine forgiveness. Some were symbolic, some were deeply personal, but none came from understanding the mechanics of the mind. No one looked inside the skull. No one studied behavior. They interpreted suffering through the lens of myth and magic. Then came Greece. And with it, a new approach, though not always a clearer one. The poets of the classical world often depicted madness as the handiwork of the gods. In the epic tales of Homer, warriors were struck with sudden insanity, their minds clouded by divine anger. Ajax, for instance, believed he was slaughtering enemies, only to discover he'd killed livestock in a fugue of rage. The gods weren't watching, they were intervening, but madness wasn't always feared. Sometimes it was revered. The philosopher Plato argued that certain types of madness were sacred, gifts from the heavens. Poetic frenzy, prophetic visions, creative ecstasy. These weren't flaws. They were blessings. To be mad in the right way was to be chosen. Still, alongside these lofty ideas, practical thinkers emerged. Hippocrates, often called the father of modern medicine, offered something different. He rejected spirits and divine interference. He blamed the humors, those four elusive fluids again. To him, melancholy wasn't a curse, it was an imbalance. Too much black bile, not enough of something else. His cure? Balance. A gentle routine, a better diet, sleep, simplicity. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And so, the ancient world stood on a precipice, torn between myth and medicine, between the sacred and the scientific. A man whispering nonsense might be a prophet, or he might be diseased, or he might be both. That uncertainty would linger for centuries. And when the classical world crumbled and gave way to the shadowed cathedrals and smoky villages of medieval Europe, the fragile compassion of Hippocrates gave way to something colder, stricter, and infinitely more dangerous, because soon madness would be seen not just as illness or inspiration, but as sin, as proof of moral failure, and the treatment, confession, chains, and sometimes fire. The medieval mind didn't leave much room for ambiguity. What the ancients had occasionally framed as a curse, a chemical imbalance, or divine insight was now distilled into one stark diagnosis: sin. Madness, to the medieval church, wasn't a condition. It was a verdict. By the time the Black Death swept through Europe, the older ideas of Hippocrates, humors, imbalance, and treatment had been mostly buried beneath the weight of doctrine. The soul, not the body, was the battleground. And if someone wandered through the streets muttering to themselves, if they wept without cause or screamed at shadows, the assumption wasn't illness. It was that the devil had moved in. Possession became the default explanation. Spiritual weakness, unconfessed guilt, a lapse in faith. These were the supposed cracks through which evil entered. And once a person was labeled touched by Satan, the community had only a handful of tools left. Prayer, penance, punishment. A woman too eccentric, too outspoken, or too unkempt might be accused of witchcraft. A nobleman racked with grief, unable to eat or rise from bed, might be declared damned. The mad were not given space to heal. They were paraded, poked, and punished. Some towns chained them in public squares for their own safety, it was said, though the gawking crowds suggested otherwise. People tossed coins, children threw stones. Madness became theater. And for those who weren't visible, those hidden behind monastery walls or locked away in dungeons, their lives were quieter, but no less cruel. There were no asylums, not yet. No hospitals for the mind. The best-case scenario for many was a dark room in a monastery, tended to by monks who prayed more than they cleaned. One place, however, offered something different, though not better. In London, a hospital was founded that would become infamous across the continent. Bethlehem Royal Hospital, or, as the world came to know it, Bedlam. At first, it was a place of shelter, but very quickly, Bedlam became something else, a spectacle. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the mentally ill were chained to walls or left to howl behind iron bars. Wealthy visitors paid admission to tour the halls. They came not with compassion, but with curiosity. Madness had become entertainment. Treatments, if they could be called that, were based more on superstition than care. Ice baths, purges, bleeding, whipping, all designed to drive out the demon. All of it brutal. All of it based on fear, not understanding. But not all hope was lost. While Christian Europe narrowed its view of mental illness, other parts of the world were experimenting with gentler paths. In Islamic medicine, scholars like Avicenna preserved the humoral theory and combined it with observations of the mind. Some hospitals in Moorish Spain treated the mentally ill with music therapy, gardens, and quiet reflection. They did not always succeed, but they tried. These rare moments of humanity stood in stark contrast to the cruelty elsewhere. For most medieval Europeans, if your mind broke, the world offered three options: a priest, a prison, or a pyre. There was no room for vulnerability, no safe space for those whose pain was invisible. And so, the age of madness hardened. Chains replaced understanding, stigma replaced support. And for centuries, the mind remained a mystery that most societies would rather punish than protect. But as the Renaissance dawned, bringing with it art, inquiry, and the flickering return of reason, madness began to change shape again. Not yet cured, not yet understood, but no longer completely invisible. The question was, would this new era finally offer healing, or simply find smarter ways to hide the broken? The Renaissance, often painted as a golden bloom of beauty and knowledge, offered the world rediscovered science, breathtaking art, and the stirring belief that humanity was capable of greatness. But for those suffering within the quiet torment of their own minds, the promise of enlightenment was still far from reach. True, some progress returned. The writings of Hippocrates and Galen resurfaced, dusted off in universities and translated in libraries. Physicians began, once again, to speak of the body as a system, of illness as imbalance rather than sin. Madness, they said, could be explained not through curses, but through bile, temperament, and the arrangement of the stars. Yes, the stars. Astrology found its way into medicine, with certain signs blamed for melancholia or hysteria. A mood swing might be Mercury's fault. A nervous collapse? Perhaps Mars was rising. Science was stretching its limbs, but superstition still held the pen. The idea of the four humors returned in force. Melancholia, what we now call depression, was tied to an excess of black bile. Mania to yellow. Treatments followed suit, gentler than medieval punishments, but still questionable. Bloodletting remained popular. So did induced vomiting, fasting, and the use of spinning chairs meant to jostle the brain back into alignment. Asylums began to appear more frequently, not as places of healing, but of containment. In France and Italy, these were vast buildings at the edge of cities where the unpredictables could be tucked away, out of sight and out of mind. They were cleaner than dungeons, perhaps, but not by much. Still, within this swirling mix of progress and cruelty, there were voices of compassion. Too few, too easily silenced, but present. One of the most remarkable came from the Netherlands. A physician named Johann Weyer, writing in the 1500s, dared to challenge the prevailing view of mental illness. He argued that many women accused of witchcraft weren't wicked. They were sick. His book, On the Tricks of Demons, defended the mentally ill, insisting they needed care, not execution. He was ignored. Worse, his work was condemned. The church banned his writings, and his message, so far ahead of its time, was buried beneath fear and fire. Meanwhile, madness remained a convenient accusation. In courts and families across Europe, it became a tool. An inconvenient wife, a rebellious daughter, a political rival. Any of them could be labeled mad and confined. No trial, no appeal, just silence. The Renaissance may have opened the body to study, but the mind remained a locked room. Art and literature, though, told a different story. They gave madness form, character, even dignity. Ophelia drifting into watery grief. Don Quixote chasing windmills in the name of chivalry. The madman became a tragic hero, a poetic soul crushed beneath the weight of a world too sharp, too cruel, too real. But admiration didn't equal understanding. Society still didn't know what to do with the broken. The Renaissance offered them a mirror. It did not offer a cure. That contradiction between progress and punishment, between insight and indifference, would only sharpen in the age to come. Because as the Enlightenment marched in, carrying torches of reason and rationality, the mind would finally be dissected like any other organ. But would it be healed or simply classified, measured and imprisoned? The Enlightenment arrived like a tide, cold, brilliant, and unyielding. Reason was its torch, science its language, and faith in human progress its anthem. Across Europe, thinkers declared that light could conquer ignorance. That knowledge, once shackled by superstition, would liberate mankind. But when it came to the mind, fractured, frightened, and misunderstood, the light revealed just how far there was to go. One by one, the devils were driven out, not by priests, but by doctors with degrees. Possession gave way to pathology. The mad were no longer blamed for their own collapse, at least not entirely. They were labeled, sorted, and catalogued. Their cries weren't signs of sin. They were symptoms. But the institutions that housed them, they didn't look like temples of healing. They looked like warehouses for the forgotten. Asylums multiplied across the continent. Massive structures were erected outside city walls, their architecture grand and imposing. They were symbols of progress, but also of fear. These were not clinics. They were containment zones. Places where the broken could be put away, quietly, permanently. Inside, life was structured and sterile. Patients were no longer shackled to walls, at least not always. Chains were removed in public gestures of reform. French physician Philippe Pinel famously unbound inmates at the Bicêtre Asylum in 1793, a move celebrated as revolutionary. But the walls remained. The rules, too. A new philosophy emerged. Moral treatment. It sounded noble. In practice, it meant obedience. Madness, they believed, stemmed from moral failure, laziness, indulgence, lack of discipline. So the cure was routine. Quiet walks, clean beds, long lectures. Patients were expected to dress properly, speak politely, and nod on cue. If they complied, they were improving. If they resisted, they were lost. It was healing as conformity. The soul wasn't purged with fire anymore. It was reshaped with schedules and sermons. There were exceptions. The York Retreat in England, founded by Quakers, offered a gentler model. Here, patients were treated with dignity. They strolled through gardens, spoke with kind attendants, and were given space to breathe. It was rare, but it proved something powerful. Kindness was not weakness. It could, in some cases, even restore what had been broken. At the same time, something else began to change. Paperwork. Doctors started recording symptoms. Notes were kept, patterns identified. Psychiatry was forming awkwardly, painfully, but with purpose. The mind, long left to mystics and poets, was being observed like a specimen. And yet even as science advanced, empathy often lagged behind. The mentally ill were no longer devils or prophets. Now, they were puzzles, cases, objects of curiosity. In the pursuit of understanding, humanity was sometimes lost. Society traded superstition for surveillance. It was a step forward, yes, but a cold one. As the Enlightenment tried to illuminate the darkest corners of human suffering, it brought clarity, but not yet compassion. The Victorian age was waiting, an era obsessed with order, appearances, and purity. An era that would peer into the human mind and recoil at what it found. The Victorian era prided itself on refinement. It polished its silver, pressed its linens, and presented itself as a civilization of impeccable manners and moral superiority. But beneath its tidy veneer, shadows gathered, unseen, unspoken, but always present. Among them, none more misunderstood than the suffering of the mind. This was the age of contradictions. Scientific breakthroughs dazzled the public, while rigid social codes choked any deviation. And nowhere was that contradiction more glaring than in the treatment of mental illness. For women particularly, this contradiction had a name: hysteria. Borrowed from the Greek word for uterus, it became a convenient label for anything that didn't sit well with the men in power. Mood swings, ambition, sexual desire, even boredom, all could be diagnosed as hysteria. The implication was clear. A woman's emotions were dangerous. Her body was the problem, her mind unreliable. The prescribed cures ranged from patronizing to cruel. Some doctors favored vibratory therapy. Yes, exactly what it sounds like, believing it would reset the nerves. Others suggested a swift marriage, or a child, or absolute silence. One physician, Dr. Weir Mitchell, championed the infamous rest cure. A woman would be confined to bed for weeks, no reading, no writing, no talking, just lying still, surrounded by floral wallpaper and moral judgment. The cure was supposed to restore feminine delicacy. Instead, it often broke people. Writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman endured this very treatment. Her short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, was a scream on paper, a tale of isolation, repression, and a mind unraveling behind a locked bedroom door. Meanwhile, male patients weren't necessarily faring better. At the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot held theatrical lectures where he hypnotized female patients before an audience of elite students and socialites. Women convulsed, twisted, collapsed, demonstrating their hysteria like exhibits in a gallery. Among the spectators was a young Sigmund Freud, taking notes for a new theory he would one day call psychoanalysis. Asylums during this period grew into vast complexes, often hidden behind hedgerows and high stone walls. Some resembled country estates, others resembled prisons. They were designed to contain, not cure. Admission was easy, especially for those society wanted to forget. Women labeled difficult, sons who drank too much, elders who grieved too openly. Once inside, escape was rare. A single signature could lock you away. Getting out took several, and luck. Outside the asylum walls, appearances were everything. Families hid their institutionalized members. Obituaries left out inconvenient details. Madness was scandal, a stain on a household's reputation. The goal wasn't healing, it was erasure. And yet, culture continued to romanticize the mad. In literature and art, the madman was a tortured genius, a misunderstood soul broken by a cruel world. Think Hamlet, lost in grief. Think Ophelia, drowned in sorrow. Madness became a metaphor, but that metaphor rarely translated into mercy. The Victorians mastered the art of concealment. Beneath their corsets and coats, they buried emotion, grief, and mental anguish under layers of propriety. But the weight didn't vanish. It pressed inward, quietly, crushing those who had no language to describe their pain. The asylum may have replaced the dungeon, but for many, it still meant the same thing: silence, exile, and the slow forgetting of a life that once belonged to the world. Soon, however, the world would be forced to listen. The 20th century was coming, and with it, a war so devastating it would shatter the mind of an entire generation and finally bring madness out of the shadows and onto the battlefield. The 20th century did not tiptoe in. It exploded. The Great War, the war to end all wars, unleashed a kind of violence that scorched not just the flesh, but the soul. Trenches carved into Europe's body became graves before they were even dug. The endless thud of artillery, the cries of dying men, the poison of gas. It all became too much for the human mind to bear. And at last, the world had no choice but to see what madness really looked like. They called it shell shock. At first, doctors believed it was caused by physical trauma, an invisible concussion from the force of explosions. But soon, they saw a pattern they couldn't explain with bruises or shrapnel. Men who hadn't been near a blast shook uncontrollably. Some couldn't speak. Others screamed at night, curled in corners, or walked in circles as if trying to escape their own minds. These weren't cowards. They were soldiers. Many decorated, many brave. And yet the war had cracked them. Not their bodies, their identities. Some generals dismissed it as malingering, weakness, excuses. A few soldiers were executed for desertion, shot not because they fled, but because no one recognized that their minds had already broken. It was a tragedy within a tragedy. But slowly, voices of compassion rose. At Craig Lockhart War Hospital in Scotland, a quiet revolution was taking place. Dr. William Rivers, a psychologist, treated soldiers not with punishment, but with patience. He listened, he asked questions, he encouraged expression, not suppression. One of his patients was Siegfried Sassoon, a poet and war hero. Rivers urged him to write, to turn trauma into verse. And in doing so, Sassoon's voice joined a chorus of veterans who began to tell the truth about what war did to the mind. For the first time, mental illness wasn't an abstract concept. It was everywhere. It marched with the troops. It sat in wheelchairs. It stared blankly at walls. The public could no longer pretend it was rare. After the war, the term shell shock became controversial. Some doctors sought to redefine it, to fit it into newer, cleaner categories. Others saw it as the first real glimpse of what we now understand as trauma, stress disorders, and PTSD. The language wasn't there yet, but the reality was undeniable. When World War II arrived, medicine was better prepared. The term changed to combat fatigue. Treatment came quicker. But the shame lingered. Soldiers were expected to be steel, but steel, it turned out, could shatter too. The world was finally beginning to grasp what the ancients had only guessed at, that the human mind has limits, that survival isn't always visible, and that even the strongest can break. Shell shock marked a turning point. It tore down the myth that madness only touched the weak or the wicked. It forced open the doors of psychiatry, and it left behind a trail of silent, staring men who had looked into the abyss and were never quite able to look away. But in the years that followed, as peace returned and war faded into parades and history books, psychiatry began to change again. No longer satisfied with observation or talk, doctors turned their gaze inward, to the brain itself, and with scalpels and electricity, they reached for what they believed was a cure.